Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. In another episode, I spoke about entering the Tao through the back door, which was a relatively new concept. Only in the last few years did I come across that concept, even though it's millennia old. It's out of the Eastern religions. A few years ago, I was watching a PBS documentary called Einstein's Riddle, which had to do with quantum physics. And in that, they spoke about Esalen, and I mentioned this in my book, that they mentioned Esalen, which is a consciousness, how do they call it? Higher potential consciousness place south of Big Sur along the coast in California to explore human potentiality. That's the word I was looking for. And in this documentary, it also mentioned a book called The Tao of Physics. I'm not sure if there's glare on that, by Fritjof Capra. At the time, I didn't have the book, but I pulled it up and I found it interesting because Dr. Capra, I believe it's a doctor, has a PhD in physics. As I understand it, he was from Austria. I'm not sure when he moved to the US. And basically, the subtitle, an exploration of the parallels between modern physics and Eastern mysticism. How's that for you? Who thought there were parallels there? And so he actually speaks as a physicist, talks quite a bit about the Eastern part of the religion. And at the time, I'd started skimming through it, and I just finished reading some books involving Eastern religion. Another book that I don't have it handy here is called The Tao of Psychology by Dr. Bolin, Jean Shinoda Bolin. That's a pretty easy read, a fairly short book. I just reread it or reskimmed it a few weeks ago. But what I love is when information finds me. And so just a week or so ago, I have a friend who has a used bookstore in town. I always go in, check out the psychology section, check out the spiritual section. And actually, she has a small philosophy section that's kind of on the end cap on the row behind where the psychology section is. I turned and I noticed another book by Fritjof Capra in the philosophy sections of all places. Now, at the time, I knew that there was a book by Stanislav Grof, also in the philosophy section, called The Adventures of Self-Discovery, which is a book I already own. Now, Dr. Grof is he was originally born in Czechoslovakia, immigrated to the US, I think back in the 60s or early 70s, and is a psychiatrist. He's in his 90s now. And I've referred to him in a number of other books or a number of other episodes. I refer to him in the book. There's a lot of useful information. But so I pulled out this book called The Turning Point, which I'd never heard of. I hadn't looked up all of Capra's work, but I did get a chuckle that right at the front, he mentions in the author's note, it is my privilege and pleasure to acknowledge the help and advice of, and he lists four people, the first of which is Stanislav Grof. And I thought, this might come in handy. So I went ahead and grabbed it. And it's a fantastic book. I'm not even done yet. I've only read about 3 chapters, but I skimmed down through the title or the table of contents. And there's a 40-page chapter on the biomedical model, not just in terms of mental health, but in terms of physical health as well, and how these models that we have that we still operate under are basically very tied into the Cartesian Rene Descartes concept, from 300 years ago of our separateness, how we're individuals, how we're, the mind is separate than the body. I know a lot of times people who follow that don't even believe in the soul, much less, it ties in with the materialism of what we can study and what we can measure, and very much that type of science. And there are so many passages in here. I'll show you. I go out to Subway quite a bit and read. I'll have my breakfast sandwich and read. And then I'll take pieces of napkins and put it in there just as like, oh, that's a good one. And some of these books I treat like textbooks. Even though I've celebrated my 29th birthday many times now, but I treat them like textbooks. I'll highlight sections, I'll mark, I'll, try and highlight it so that I can go back at some point and really cull out some of the most pertinent things. But the way he describes this as a physicist, and he says in his intro, is that his goal is to present this to a general audience, not the scientific minded and not the highly educated, if you will, the university trained. But I feel he does present it in a way that is pretty easily understood. And so the chapter I just started looking at this morning or earlier today had to do with our economic system and how it is designed in a certain way, and he mentions how basically our different sciences try to be independent of one another, but in reality they aren't. And to me, that ties in with this whole Tao concept that I mentioned in a previous segment. My understanding of the Tao is, yes, it cannot be described, it cannot be defined. If you have a definition for it, you know you're wrong, according to Lao Tzu, because it defies definition. But to me, it has to do with that bigness of who we collectively are, of the overall web of interaction, not just the physical, but the imaginary, the experiential, the memories, all of it. It's like everything's part of the Tao. At least that's the way I understood it. And so, yeah, I look forward to, and I actually looked it up. Dr. Capra is about 90 years old now. And so I do hope to pull up maybe some interviews that maybe he's given. Definitely plan on it. He has a website. Probably go and submit something to him and say, hey, thanks for your work. Because it's interesting because, again, even since I got this, I pulled up the Tao of Physics again. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's why I didn't finish it, is so much of the language, at least early on, had more to do with the Eastern mysticism, which is a little more difficult for me to understand because that isn't what I grew up with. But yeah, this the way he pulls in so much material in this turning point, to me, is fascinating. It weaves in, he provides summaries of so much information of how different scientists have contributed. He talks about the evolution of biology and how that relates to genetics and how that relates to, it's really impressive what he's doing there. And and this is where I wasn't actually planning on recording this so soon after reading it, and at some point I'll probably do a better summary, but there's just so darn much information in here that I wanted to give a highlight and a call out to that. So thanks for joining me. And like I say, it was a fluky thing where I happened to turn my head. Who would have thought? I certainly would not have thought to look at that or look for that in the philosophy section. And yet it ties in with the overall wellness of who we are on the planet and the need for these systems to evolve. That's part of what I was reading today, was like by trying to treat economics as a separate system without looking at the value system of a society, you're not serving people very well. He mentioned that in terms of other systems, other sciences, especially the soft sciences, and how back when physics, the Newtonian physics, this was something that it works well in the range where it works well. And in a chapter I was reading last week, he mentioned that even in terms of medical progress, they've done astounding things in specific areas. You can look at surgery, you can look at any number of specific things. And yet, I should say this book came out in 1980, 87, I think it was. I think the first version was published in 82. So this book is about 40 years old. And he talks about all these advances. And yet then he points out and says, yet in our society, our overall health isn't really significantly better. We still have these diseases and illnesses and what have you, and relates that to environmental factors, not just specific, mechanistic factors, which the mechanistic is very much the Cartesian, the Descartes part of it. But even in this chapter I was starting today, who's distinguishing between the hard sciences, where physics was one of the first sciences where they could establish these mathematical relationships between mass and force and gravity and speed and acceleration and all that. But the soft sciences have much more to do with the things that can't be measured, the values of a society, that type of thing. But he also points out how with Newtonian physics, he calls it Newtonian physics, after Isaac Newton, of course. And he says, that operates within a range, and it does very well in that range. The speed with which a car accelerates, or what have you, right? The force needed to dig a hole, or what have you. But you get beyond that range where it works really well, you need a new paradigm, a new shift in thinking, which in terms of physics was quantum physics, right, at the start of the 20th century. And that, of course, upset some apple carts. That it upset a number of physicists who, they thought they had the model. This is the model. And of course, as quantum physics, it fills in parts where the Newtonian physics just doesn't work. And he points out in multiple places, and just in the few chapters I've read, that a number of these systems we have need to go through that kind of revolution. That, hey, this works here, but it doesn't work over here. We need something bigger. We need something different. We need something more like modern physics than just what we've been doing. And as I came home from reading this earlier today, it reminded me that when I went through this thing in 98, and I had made a number of notes and diagrams just to try and, at that time, it wasn't even so much to capture what I was thinking at the time. It was just to get it out of my body and onto paper. Where was I going with that? Crud. But it was, what I'd said was that every industry on the planet needs to be shaken to its core. Again, looking at these abusive, manipulative systems. By that point, I had come up with the phrase, forget the hokey pokey, abuse, manipulation, domination, and control. That's what it's all about. Again, that's that Tao from the back door side of it, coming in through the back door. Now, it's not my intent to be ultra negative, but there's a lot more manipulation and attempts to dominate and coerce than we're really conscious of because of the conditioning we're involved with. Now, for a lot of people, you can deflect it, you can, but it still affects your subconscious, which means I look at it as we're not a healthy culture. I'm recording this in 2025 in the United States. And somewhere in here, we really do need to look at not just physical health, which of course is important, food supply, stuff like that. But this whole thing of constantly manipulating people to convince them, I need this. Nah, you just want it. I've come up with something new. I'm talking about our economic system. I've come up with something new, and now I need to convince you to buy it. I don't know, is that healthy? I'm not saying it doesn't, that certain people don't need it or can't benefit from it, but this constant manipulation, this just prolonged, I don't know what you call it, just, abuse, manipulation, domination, and control. And even in the book today, I think it was domination and control he used. So of course I underlined it, that it's so much more pervasive than what we are conscious of. So it'll be interesting for me anyway to finish reading this, but I just thought I'd mention his work over these next however many sessions. I do hope to discuss different people's works that I found interesting, but especially then when I remembered that in that state of non-ordinary consciousness, as I looked at these abusive systems, I was like, there isn't one that doesn't need to be shaken to its core in order to bring about something better, a better economic system, a better mental health system, where we look at not just the individual, which is the Cartesian approach, but what is that person's history? What is that person's environment? How is that embedded in their psyches and used as reference information? Bessel van der Kolk is a Dutch psychiatrist. Well, he's from Holland. I don't know when he immigrated to the US. I think it was back in the 70s. But his book, The Body Keeps the Score, of how trauma gets stored in our system, in our nervous system, in our energetic fields, if you will. So yeah, but I love how these things come together, and I love when I come across materialists. I was going to say how I come across material that reinforces what I figured out on my own, but at the same time, it can be excessively frustrating to realize there was a bit of a movement there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s looking at consciousness, looking at, from my type of experience, a number of people were doing a better job then than they are now. And that's a tragic, tragic thing to say. And even earlier today when I was reading, he mentioned how many scientists, they don't believe in consciousness. I think it was B.F. Skinner, the focus was on behavior, and behavior alone had nothing to do with consciousness. And I thought, scratch him from my list. Not necessarily, but it's an interesting, when you've come across someone's material who has such resonance with such a deep experience of how this material came through to me, there's a validation there, a verification, or at least the sense that, no, I'm not alone in this, which can be very helpful. And in another segment, I'd mentioned, using books like this to look through the bibliography, look through the endnotes. Who do they reference? And you can use that material often to find other people whose works might help you through such an experience. So anyway, I just wanted to share a little bit about his work and how I just happened upon it and stumbled upon it. And I look forward to incorporating, studying more of what he has in there so that I can reference it even better and more easily. So thanks again for joining me. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.